Hi, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. Today, what's fair in free trade? Do trade agreements that favour corporate power also favour public interests? There are so many hashtags in this conversation, so many that Malika Blau, our digital producer, she's not even going there. She's not even going to tell you all of the multiple ones they are, but we will get to some of them in this conversation. Meanwhile, what are you going to tell us?
Well, there is a lot of conversation online about this on both sides of this kind of heated debate, really.
Sure.
In fact, some activists on one side of the debate are planning a Twitter storm for Tuesday night. Take a look at my screen here. That Twitter storm, the idea behind it is to flood Twitter with messages of concern against one such trade deal. So we'll talk about that activism really during today's show. We can't do it without you, of course, so tweet us your questions and comments with hashtag AJStream.
Now sitting with us in our studio we have John Hillary, and John is the Executive Director of War on Want. That's an anti-poverty charity based in the UK. He's also the author of the book The Poverty of Capitalism, Economic Meltdown and the Struggle for What Comes Next. John, it's great to have you here.
Thank you so much.
We'll hear a lot more from you in just a moment. But first, a little background on this issue. Behind closed doors, nations may be deciding to give multinational corporations more rights to sue governments for damages. It's one of several issues being debated as a US-EU trade negotiations are underway. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, aims to increase commerce. It encompasses nearly half of the global GDP and could be the world's largest bilateral free trade agreement in history. But protesters argue that proposed free trade deals like TTIP work against public interest issues ranging from internet privacy to food safety, environmental regulations and even democracy. So today we want to understand what impact free trade agreements like TTIP could have on average citizens. So to help us discuss this, we have Simon Lester. He's a trade policy analyst with the Cato Institute in Washington, DC. In Brussels, we have Luisa Santos. She's Director of International Relations for Business Europe. That's an advocacy group for European business interests. And in Washington, DC, Melinda St. Louis is an International Campaigns Director for Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. So welcome everybody to the stream. John, if I look at your Twitter account, all the way through it, I see free trade, I see hashtag TTIP, lots of other acronyms, all about big free trade deals. If we went out and asked the international man on the street what TTIP was, what do you think we'd find?
Well, I think a lot of people don't really know about it because it's been negotiated entirely in secret.
Right.
What you get from activists who have heard about it is outrage, because they can see that it's going to be a real threat to their lives, to their futures, often for their jobs. We know, for example, that 1 million people under the official estimates are going to lose their jobs as a direct result of TTIP. So I think the more people learn about it, the more shocked and angered they become.
All right, so let's do a little bit of that right now. Simon, TTIP, what's your best sell for it?
Well, I hate to be nuanced here, but I think we really have to distinguish between a couple different things that the TTIP would do. And one is lower tariffs on goods and services and open up services markets to foreign competition and get rid of discriminatory laws and regulations. And all of that is just great for consumers. We all benefit. Don't we like to be able to buy Fiats and Volkswagens here in the US? Yes, we do. We wouldn't want those companies shut out of our market. So that's on the pure goods side of things. But then in addition, you have provisions on intellectual property and the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism that you mentioned, where I share some of the skepticism and concern and feel like we're burdening trade agreements with things that are more pro-business and not pro-consumer. And then in addition to that, you have issues of harmonizing regulations, where I think
So Simon, hold on a minute, slow down a minute. So that's your best sell to the international man on the street?
I don't want to try to sell it too hard, because I think we need to think critically about it. And I think the best sell is that the good parts of it will bring us lower priced, higher quality goods and services, and that's good for all consumers, especially for consumers. So let's stop at the good parts of this, because we're going to unpack this a little bit. Yep. But you were actually disagreeing with Simon as he was saying, we all love this, and you were like,
Absolutely. I think he's far too optimistic even on those sides of things. Take services, for example. The services which are being opened up as a result of these deals include education, health services, rail, post, all of the things which we consider to be essential public services for our lives. Do we really want big business taking them over so that we don't have access to them anymore? That's not about consumer choice.
Give us an example here.
This is not, I'm sorry if I may say.
Yeah, please go ahead.
This is not big business.
Yeah.
This is not big business. We are talking here about opportunities for SMEs. People keep dragging the debate for big business, and this is not true. As I said, big business is already in the market. It doesn't need TTIP.
So, Louisa,
we are
an SME...
for small and medium-sized companies and not for big business.
Right, okay, small, medium-sized companies. Okay, John?
But no, actually what it's about is these big business interests trying to get into new markets where they've never been able to get into before. And that's on both sides of the Atlantic, not just the public health services.
Why isn't it like opening up the global market? So you've got the US, you've got 28 European countries here, all collaborating together. Why wouldn't that be great?
Because for us, there are certain parts of the market which shouldn't be open to business at all. Take health services, which is so important in Europe. We have the privilege of having free health services at the point of need because it's delivered by the public sector. We don't want big US health corporations coming in and seeing that as a profit-making opportunity, because we know that if you're rich, it's fantastic, but if you're not rich, you're going to get left out. Now, that's the sort of thing which is at the heart of this deal, opening up services for profit, not for people.
Well, Melinda, it's our community online. I want to get in here because I want to bring this tweet in. Our community is watching this and they're agreeing and disagreeing. So one person is agreeing with John with what you just said. Melinda, have a look at this tweet. Simi says, how does this affect people versus corporate controlled entities? Because we're seeing that those two things being pitted together. You see in this tweet, common people versus corporate controlled. So in your everyday life, Melinda, how will this affect you?
Well, I think it's important to know who is at the table and who is actually helping to write these rules. And the reality is, it is big business that is helping to write these rules. In the US, there are nearly 600 corporate advisors. There's only a handful of anyone representing any other sector that have basically a seat at the table. And so all the skepticism that exists is very warranted, and it is happening in secret. And it isn't enough to say that free trade as a theory is going to help consumers. It matters what's actually in the text and what what is being negotiated. And the reason we are concerned, and the reason I think that's a very important tweet, is that who is at the table, the large corporations, are the ones who are going to set the rules for their benefit. And that's what we've seen in these kinds of trade agreements in the past, and we have no reason to think that we would be seeing something better now, because the reality is these corporate courts are supposed to be in this agreement. And these intellectual property provisions that are going to extend patents and monopolies are intended to be in this agreement. And so to say that in theory it's great to have free trade that's going to benefit consumers just doesn't cut it in terms of what it's going to mean on the ground for the people and the planet. We know that corporations would be able to attack our environmental laws, that they'll be able to attack our public health laws in these secret courts if this goes through.
Melinda, how do we know this if it's secret? We don't actually have access as I don't know, civil society, everyday people who are concerned about what might happen to us in terms of our trade agreements. How do you even know that?
Well, we know because there have been some things that have leaked, and whenever we see these leaks, we actually see that unfortunately our worst fears have been confirmed. We know that the corporations have been very explicit about what they want out of it. They're very clear that they want to have these corporate courts in the agreement. We know that the mandate of the agreement includes that, and we're concerned about what the nitty-gritty will be at the textual level. But what we've seen is very concerning. We know that there are that in there the corporations are very interested in going after the way we set our regulations to begin with. Our public policy, our democracies, we decide what we want to eat, we decide what we want, what is consumer safety, and we don't want that to be overridden by negotiations that are happening behind closed doors.
Well, Louisa, you heard Melinda talk about the leaks and that being the way we know about this online. That's causing a lot of concern for people. So Abhinav says, in an open world, why have a closed door deal which gives access to resources of the country? It's profits that are targeted by riches. Another person, Andreas, says there's no such thing as transparency within TTIP. The documents are still kept secret, as well as the list of negotiators. Is this normal for trade agreements? Should we know what's going on, and is there precedent for that?
First, I would like to say a few words on what was said before. I mean, TTIP will not put in question public policy. So if a government decides that health care is public domain, it will continue to have the power to do so. So it's not true that TTIP will put that in question. That's the first thing. The second thing is ISDS and the so-called courts.
Okay, so I'm going to stop you here. Every time someone does an acronym, I'm going to screech to a stop. Louisa, hold on. No one understands what you're talking about unless they're actually in this
conversation.
So I'm just going to share it with you. ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement. Yeah, it's for foreign investors to be able to sue a foreign government. Now, please continue, Louisa.
Sorry. The question here is, most of the decisions of these so-called obscure courts are in favor of the states and not the companies. So it seems on the debate that all the decisions are in favor of the companies. That's not true. On the question of transparency and the transparency in the negotiations, I don't know what happens in the US. In the EU, we have an advisory group that was created. This was the first time such a group was created in the EU to accompany the negotiation. And we have there representatives of business, representatives of the trade unions, representatives of the consumers, and of NGOs, both in environment as well as health. So it's quite a broad range of interests that are there. We have the chance to see the text, it's true. We have the chance to see the text. We are obliged, of course.
So Louisa, how did you get to see the text? How did you get to see the text and other people haven't been able to see it?
Because that's the reason why we are an advisory group. But we need also, we need to understand that in order to arrive to a meaningful result, not everything has to be made public.
All right, take a breath for a moment, because I've got two other people want to join in the conversation.
Everyone knows what you want to negotiate? No.
All right, take a pause so I can share the conversation.
The European Union has put a 30-year ban on all public access to the key documents. We have the letter stating that in black and white. To say that there is transparency in these negotiations is a downright untruth. So that's the first thing. The second thing, yes, business knows about it because business told the European Commission what to write. This idea that small or family firms have been involved is complete nonsense. We have the list of the 119 secret meetings which the European Commission had together with big business interests. All of the texts have been written by business for business. And public policy comes nowhere at all of that. An example for you, take a real world example of what this means with these courts. In Australia, the government introduced new laws requiring all cigarettes to be packaged in plain packaging, so you couldn't have the logos and everything. Philip Morris, the big US tobacco corporation, is suing the Australian government for billions of dollars. Why? Because it feels it's going to lose profits as a result of that law. Similar things around the whole world. Veolia, the French company, suing the Egyptian government for raising the minimum wage. I mean, that's the sort of thing which we're talking about here. And that's why we believe this agreement is completely and utterly written for big business. It's a charter for multinational corporations. And it's a disaster for working people and small and medium-sized business.
Let me just quickly illustrate what you were talking about here. Just hold tight for a moment, guests. Here we've got the Global Mail. We've got the kind of packaging that Australia was thinking. We're going to change the packaging for cigarettes. We want people to know that potentially there's a cancer risk here. And here's the headline: Big Tobacco's lawsuits of mass destruction. Just hold tight for a moment, guests, because our community also want to join in this conversation. Malika.
Well, picking up on what John said, mentioning that this is by businesses, for businesses, Joel on Twitter says not all businesses are equal. So Simon, he writes, TTIP is good for small business, startups, entrepreneurs. All businesses aren't Monsanto, and he's referencing the agricultural giant there. EU has strong citizen-oriented rights. So what are the benefits, in your view, for small businesses?
again, I mean, for small businesses, if that's where you want to focus, I mean, the benefit is access to new export markets. But again, I think the real benefit here is to consumers. We as consumers get access to better quality goods and services. Now, Melinda and John both suggested that I'm talking about free trade in theory and not in practice, but I think that's completely wrong. I'm talking about free trade in practice. I mean, do we want to live in a world where people in America can only buy GM cars and Fords and Chryslers? No, I don't think so. I think we're very happy that we get to benefit from free trade and buy products made all over the world. And I'm a little skeptical that John and Melinda are actually critical of that. And that they want a world where every market is segmented and you can only buy products from your own producers.
Well, between the U.S. and Europe, there are already extraordinary low tariffs, which is what are the taxes that would be barriers to these goods. So it's been very explicit and clear that this agreement is about going what they call behind the border and going after these non-tariff barriers or trade irritants, and those are our public protections. And so to say this agreement is about lowering tariffs, the tariff lines are under 3% already.
Yeah, that's the average tariff. There are tariffs that are higher, but you would agree
there may be a few. I mean, we aren't arguing about lowering tariffs. Some may be, but this agreement is really not about that. We know, for example, in the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there are 29 chapters. Only 5 of them have anything specifically to do about trade. It's a Christmas tree where they're hanging all of these corporate giveaways on there, and it's an important part of the conversation. It needs to be explicit, and that's what people need to be concerned about. At least that's what we as a consumer organization, we care very much about consumers. For us, cheap goods is not the main goal. We want goods that are produced fairly. We want safe products. We want a healthy environment. And those are decisions that need to be decided. Those are decisions that need to be decided democratically and not undermined by a supranational body that is controlled and is unduly influenced by big business. And that's what our main concern is here.
But you think Europe's not producing goods safely? I'm very comfortable buying any goods made in Europe. So what's the objection?
I mean, I guess the question is, we have very robust trade, we have very robust investment between these countries. There may be room for more cooperation, that's fine, but this process, I just want to get back to what Louisa said. She said what was happening in Europe in the advisory group. Obviously, there are criticisms there. In the United States, there is an advisory system as well. There are more than 500 advisors in the U.S. and more than 90% of them are explicitly industry or trade associations. There is only a small handful that have of people who represent labor, or there's one consumer organization, and so this is not a balanced discussion at all in the United States.
All right, John, what did you want to add?
Well, Simon asked about whether or not Europeans are happy with US products and stuff, and I think that goes to the nub of the question. We know that in the US, for example, 70% of all of the food that is sold in supermarkets contains genetically modified ingredients. Now in Europe, we don't want anything to do with them. We've had bans on them and we want to maintain those bans. Yet the US Secretary of State for Agriculture says, who do these Europeans think they are? They need to be eating what we eat. Take beef, for example. Almost all of the beef that is produced in the US uses these bovine growth hormones, so that the cows are injected with growth hormones, they grow quicker, they become more productive, more profitable for the big industrial agribusiness firms. We have them banned in Europe because they're carcinogenic.
John, everything you're telling me, everything Melinda's telling me is negative about these giant big free trade agreements that we have going on right now. Is there anything you can see in them which go, well, that makes sense, I like that?
Well, it could be if you started from a completely different position. But unfortunately, if we were going to do it, if it was between me and Melinda, for example, then we'd have a completely better thing. We'd say, we'd start, for example, of looking at the US labor standards. The US has refused to sign up to the basic core labor standards of the International Labour Organization, on forced labor and things like that. We would say start by signing them. But instead they've said, we're not going to sign them at all. And we've been told by our government officials, this is only a race to the bottom. We're not going to be raising standards through this. It's about removing the barriers that business doesn't want to have to deal with.
All right, that's John's take. Simon, if you were in charge of a giant free trade agreement that you were at the table, where would you start?
Well, I would start with the tariffs and discriminatory laws. If I could ask John a question, John, what do you think of Buy America provisions for government procurement here in the United States? Would you get rid of those, or do you like those?
I think it's a really good question. The Buy America provisions are the provisions state by state which allow small businesses and local firms to be able to keep producing, and they protect local jobs, they protect local small businesses. Now, why should it be that big European companies, which are itching to get their hands on those contracts, why should they be allowed to do that if it means that hundreds of thousands of Americans are going to lose their jobs? And the same thing, exactly the same way around in Italy and France. Why should local firms lose their jobs? Why should local producers be forced out of the market just so big business gets another slice of the pie?
So again, you're going worst case scenario. Hold tight, everybody. I do want to hear Louisa. Louisa, what did you want to add?
No, what I'm just saying is you keep using the word big business. It's not big business. If in the US side you have the discrimination that is favor small and medium-sized business, why cannot small and medium-sized European business compete in this public procurement market? That's our objective. And by the way, we are not aiming at lowering standards. No, quite the contrary. And we also say we are not aiming at forcing European consumers to have GMOs or chlorinated chicken, by the way. I mean, if the EU and the US manage to have an agreement on air safety, why can we not manage to have an agreement on other subjects? That's the idea. The idea is not to lower the standards. The idea is to get rid of hurdles that in the end are not endangering the consumer or the health or the environment. That's our objective.
Louisa, we literally have a minute left in this part of the conversation, then I'm going to take everybody to the post show. But Louisa, why do you think that people who are critical, why do you think they're always thinking the worst case scenario? Why are they not thinking, oh, it could work to our advantage?
What's very difficult, you should ask them. I mean, we try to pass a very positive message, and the message is that this agreement is an opportunity for business, of course, but is not the big business. I insist on this, because the big business is already in the US and EU. They have invested, they are doing trade. This agreement is not going to help them, but it's going to help the small business that is not there at the moment.
All right.
And then we also think...
Melinda, hold tight for a second, let Louisa finish. Louisa,
we also think it's good for society, because if we manage to harmonize our standards, and again, I'm not saying we're going to lower it. Quite the contrary, the objective is to have the highest standards.
All right, Louisa, I hear you, and I hear the friction amongst our guests.
It will be good for the overall society.
All right, so Louisa, we will come back to Louisa and Simon, Melinda and John. We're taking them all to stream.aljazeera.com. What's happening online?
Well, Louisa ended by saying this is good for society. I'll read this tweet from Azabaz, who says, if it's going to affect the public, we have the right to know.
Okay, to be continued. And then some. Stream.aljazeera.com in the post show. But first, here's Malika with some of the other stories the stream is following.
We start in China, where Hong Kong's Occupy Central protests set a new record for Chinese social media, the most censored day of the year. Sunday marked 2014's highest number of censored posts on China's popular microblogging platform, Sina Weibo. The top censored terms, police and Hong Kong, according to analysis from Weiboscope. The rate of blocked posts was more than double that of June 4th, the anniversary of China's Tiananmen Square crackdown. Meanwhile, on Twitter, demonstrations in Hong Kong have racked up at least 1.3 million tweets since Friday. At some points, tweets topped 600 per minute for one of the most wired weekends of protest ever. Well, next up, this U.S. football celebration earned a game penalty for Muslim American player Hussein Abdullah. And netizens are crying foul. Thanking God after scoring a point is a common move among Christian players, and Twitter users didn't hesitate to point that out. Left tweets, the National Football League loved Tim Tebow's prayer as a form of celebration, but when a Muslim used prayer to celebrate, it's a penalty. Well, following the outcry, a league official took to Twitter to admit the penalty was a mistake. have another story you'd like us to cover? Just let us know using hashtag AJStream. Femi?
Thank you so much. Okay, so we were scared earlier on to mention the hashtags, but on the way out, John, the hashtags that people should look up to follow this conversation are what? The ones that you can remember?
No TTIP.
Okay.
That's the absolute best one. Start with that. No TTIP.
All right.
Also look at ISDS, this complicated investor-state dispute settlement.
He only gave you two.
That's the one which is really going to get people absolutely outraged.
And also you'll see the other side of the argument in those hashtags there as well. All right, so John will be in the post show with our other guests as well, but let me tell you about the next AJ stream. Now, the thought of having a consensual sexual relationship with a sibling is usually shocking for most people. We will discuss that in our next AJ stream. See you then. Hi, welcome back. This is the Stream's online post show. We're talking about free trade policies and the effects it could have on society. Let's get right back to the conversation. Melinda, I know you were about to respond to Louisa and then we had to move towards the end of the show. Can you remember where you wanted to pick up on?
Well, I would say that I'm very concerned about the impression that this is really about small and medium enterprises. When you look at who has been very explicit about pushing for this agreement and pushing for these negotiations, we see it's big business on both sides of the Atlantic. The Transatlantic business dialogue is big business on both sides. They've been pushing for this for more than 20 years and are jumping on this opportunity post-crisis in Europe to try to push this very aggressive agenda to try to roll back our regulatory standards. And I think it's very important to make that very concrete for people, that we talked about the genetically modified organisms or foods. We also need to talk about financial stability measures. Post-crisis, we have worked very hard in the United States to try to regulate Wall Street and big banks, and we know that one of the key asks of large banks is to try to tie government's hands in their abilities to be able to regulate in specific ways that industry. And we think that's going to set us up for another crisis in the future. And it's important for these debates to happen in the public eye. I don't see, there are plenty of negotiations that happen internationally where we see texts where the public can comment. It's only in these trade negotiations that they have to be in secret, and it doesn't make any sense, and the public isn't standing for it.
Let me just add, I completely agree with what Melinda has said there, but it's interesting that in Germany, one of the most powerful associations of small businesses has come out explicitly against TTIP, against this deal, precisely because of the powers that it's going to hand over to the big multinational corporations. In Austria, you've got small businesses taking out full-page ads in the newspapers saying they don't want anything to do with this. So for the people in Business Europe to start saying it's all about the little people, it's just complete nonsense. 1 million workers are predicted to lose their jobs directly as a result of this, at a minimum. How can that be good for small businesses? How can it be good to local communities?
How do 1 million people lose their jobs?
It happens because of the competition. When you get the big corporations come in, the big corporations have the power to open up these markets. They force the small ones out. It's just like in a small village. If you get a big supermarket comes into the small village, it wipes out all the competition. It's exactly the same principle. And that's why the European Commission, in its official statement, this isn't from us, it's from the European Commission, it says at least 1 million people will lose their jobs. Now that can't be good. That can't be good for anybody except for the big capital.
Louisa, what did you want to add?
That's not true. I'm sorry. We have studies proving it the other way around. We will create 1.3 million jobs. So I don't see. I mean, I don't see where these numbers are coming in.
It's not.
And I insist because in Business Europe we represent the national federations across EU member states. So we have among our members mostly SMEs, because that's the basis of EU economy. And don't forget one thing, even if an SME cannot export directly, if it supplies, even if it supplies a big, large corporation, it will benefit from the agreement. And this is what we are talking about. We are talking about two license procedures, one in the EU and one in the US, where for a big company, it's very easy to pass this process. They have the resources, financial and human resources. A small company doesn't. So if I have, as a small company, to wait for a license for 1 month, 2 months, of course I will lose my business. Of course I will lose money. If I'm a big company, I'm fine. I'll be able to do it. So this is what we are talking about. So it's clear that this has much more advantages for small and medium-sized companies than for big business.
All right, let me go to the community.
Well, shifting gears here a little bit, I'm following a conversation that I'm seeing online. Simon, Raul tweets in over anger that corporations might have the ability or will have the ability to sue governments. Raul says the deal empowers corporations and weakens local lawmakers who can be sued for objections. Someone else writes in, now Cool says corporations do have the right to sue, but a line needs to be drawn somewhere. So, Simon, are you concerned at all about that provision? Of course, it's not new because currently corporations can sue. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so I've been very critical of these provisions. I believe in free flows of investment, just like free trade. So I want to encourage investment, but I don't think that these investor-state dispute settlement provisions are necessary. They're more about litigation than liberalization. So I'm not the one to defend those. I've been critical. Louisa probably has a defense of those.
Sure.
I think it's an overreaching, it's unnecessary, and it distracts from the core benefits of free trade.
Actually, Simon, it's funny because I was looking through your Twitter feed today, and I found exactly what you just said here. My take on how to get hashtag TTIP done, and then one key point, take out ISDS, which is the ability for foreign investors to sue governments. Like, you don't think that's a good idea. Louisa, could you explain why that would be necessary, for a business to be able to take a government to court?
Well, in any case, and you mentioned already in your presentation, ISDS is there. So the mechanism exists already in bilateral investment agreements. It exists in international agreements like the Energy Charter. So if it's not within TTIP, you will not prevent cases like the one that we're mentioning now of Philip Morris in Australia or the Veolia case in Egypt. By the way, the Veolia case in Egypt...
Can I just say?
The Veolia case, I'm not finished yet, Melinda, so please let me finish. The Veolia case in Egypt is not about suing the government of Egypt for an increase in minimum wage. No, that's not the case. The case is the company wants to increase the price of the service that it sells to the Egyptian government. And the Egyptian government is not ready to pay for it. That's the only thing. I mean, we're not putting in question here the right of the Egyptian government to increase the minimum wage. So let's be clear. And another thing that is important to mention is that all these cases that are bringing forward, they have not been decided yet. So we don't know who will win or who will lose. In most cases, as I said, it's the state that wins. So we don't know. We're talking like if the investor will always win these cases, and this is not the reality.
But the
I have a really important,
Well, the question is, why on earth should we give these new powers to investors, to foreign companies? Because at the moment, they should follow the domestic courts like all the rest of us do.
Yes.
Open courts where you have proper tenured judges which do it in full public eye. What these do is they take it behind closed doors. It's not even a proper court. It's 3 corporate lawyers, some of whom actually work for the same companies, and they get to adjudicate whether or not these companies get millions, billions of dollars in damages. Take another case for Germany. Germany decided to phase out nuclear power from the year 2022. And now they're being sued in front of one of these secret courts by the Swedish company Vattenfall because Vattenfall won't be able to make the same level of profits after 2022. Does that mean the German people don't have the right to choose they don't want nuclear power? So it's just this whole idea of why should we give these foreign companies new powers which none of the rest of us have to be able to sue governments for perfectly decent, legitimate public policy decisions?
And it's also important to clarify that just because it exists in past agreements does not mean that it should exist in this one. If it is included in the TTIP, we would be expanding our liability and the danger of this, but there would be 71,000 corporations who currently don't have access to this mechanism who could on both sides of the Atlantic. It's 50,000 US corporations in Europe who would be newly empowered and 25,000 European corporations who would be newly empowered in the US. So this would be a vast expansion. The cases that we've seen so far would just be the tip of the iceberg. And what we're seeing is an expansion of not only the number of cases, but the types of policies that are being challenged. And even if governments win in the end, they have to spend millions and millions of taxpayer dollars just to defend these many times very frivolous cases. We're talking about public health packaging. There's a moratorium on fracking, the very controversial policy of extracting natural gas in Canada. That is being attacked by a U.S. Natural gas company. We're seeing patent policies that have to do with medicine prices are being attacked by these corporations. And so it's no longer just corporations going after smaller countries. It's developed countries too. And we are very concerned. And for that reason, in the United States, at the state level, the National Conference of State Legislatures, which goes around all of the state legislatures in the U.S., they have an official position opposing this in the U.S. In any U.S. free trade agreement.
All right, so that was Melinda St. Louis. We also had in this conversation today John Hillary, Simon Lester and Louisa Santos. Do you remember, Malika Bilal, what you said in the pre-show?
This was going to be, I think I said it wouldn't be dull.
Okay.
Which is a good way to put it.
Yes, absolutely. It wasn't dull. Guests, thank you so much. You brought energy and passion to a conversation that is not widely had, and we really appreciate it. Many thanks indeed. And so, moving on. Goodness me, what a gear change, what a subject change, but I have a feeling you're all going to be watching tomorrow. We're going to be talking about why one German ethics council just voted to decriminalize incest between consenting adults. That is going to be a fascinating conversation. We'll have it next time on the stream. Until then, thanks for watching.